in the history of America, one of the things that you mentioned that we do have a difficult time dealing with are the darker parts of our history. I mean, this is sort of a well-known aspect. I mean, I do think it can sometimes be ham-fisted to make sweeping generalizations of peoples, whether it be Americans, Muslims, Christians, Jews, whatever. But if there is an aspect of being American that seems to be fairly common in our history, going back to Jefferson, it is our inability to deal with the darker, more sordid aspects of our history. How do you feel the history of Islam in America has positively contributed to a recollection of our darker parts without dwelling on its irreparability?
Yeah. It's connected to our history, and I think that's the key. So I was 12 years old when Roots, the television series, came
Kunta
on
Kinte,
television,
sure.
exactly, with LeVar Burton playing Kunta Kinte. And that was my moment of, wait, Kunta Kinte's a Muslim? And he's, trying to live out as a Muslim and doesn't eat the pork that Fiddler, Louis Gossett gives him. And so that kind of reminder to say, yes, that is our history, unfortunately. That's a negative part of our history, the slave trade there. But Muslims were brought here as part of the slave trade. We've been contributing to this place, ever since then. And so I think that's really the key. It's not that we forget, but that we move beyond that. I think of Maya Angelou's great poem. She has lots of great poems.
She does.
Ailey Floyd Baldwin Killens Mayfield. Where she talks about friends of hers who had died, including Alvin Ailey and James Baldwin. And this last line, we can be and be better, for they existed. There's that part. Or again, going back to Dr. Maya Angelou, the poem that she wrote on the Pulse of Morning for Bill Clinton's inauguration.
I remember her
History,
reading that,
despite
actually.
its
I was
wrenching
young.
pain, cannot be unlived, but need not be lived again. I'm sort of, I don't remember it exactly, but that idea that, we have to understand that history. We have to know where we're coming from, but can we move past that? And that's where, for me, it's this idea that American Muslims are an American success story. We're living out the ideals of what it means to be an American, in a very different kind of way. The thing that was most troubling to me about the Charlottesville incident wasn't the anti-Semitism. I want to be very clear there that, when the protesters were saying Jews will not replace us, the anti-Semitism, that didn't surprise me, because unfortunately there's a history of anti-Semitism around the world in this country. That was nothing new. You've heard those kinds of insidious remarks about Jews, for centuries. What was worrying to me was the blood and soil chant. This idea.
I agree with you completely.
But it's that idea that, in Europe, it really is about blood and soil. Being born in Germany is enough to give you German citizenship. In America, the allegiance isn't to a king or a prince or a pope or a bloodline. It's to a piece of paper, the Constitution. Do you believe in this? Do you accept those ideals? And American Muslims, like other Americans, overwhelmingly say, yes, we do. And I think that's that idea of, how do you go on? How do you progress? How do you live out? How do you prosper? Which is really the model of America.
Yeah, you actually hit on something that I find to be the most disturbing about a kind of retrograde story of America right now, which is the idea of, and you captured it exactly, and it does harken back to the sort of Teutonic, Germanic blood and soil, of this land.
Right.
We are the marrow of this country. Right. And to me, I remember, and I don't like to engage too much in discussions about Trump and this and that. I feel like it boxes you in.
Sure.
But one of the aspects of the rhetoric that I found most troubling was this idea of nativism, because the aspect of Americanism, which I hear you linking to the history of Islam and Muslims in America, is the idea of America. It's precisely that no one gets to own that spot of ground, right? It's the idea that is ascendant. It's the idea that's aspirational and is never adhered to as one would expect an American Muslim could relate to, right? Because of the idea of submission, right? And the idea of perfecting oneself, the constant attempt to be a better person,
Absolutely.
seems consonant with the American idea.
Yeah, and I think there's two things there. One is the religiosity. So Americans are, off the charts religious compared to
yes,
Europeans, roughly speaking.
Right.
American Muslims, if you look at all the surveys, are almost exactly the same as American Christians in terms of the level of their religiosity. Not any less religious, but not any more religious. So there's that part to it. The other part is that you come here as an immigrant precisely because of the American dream, precisely because we have this mythology of a land of immigrants, a beacon unto the world, the Statue of Liberty, that kind of work. And the fact that here you can succeed, not because of who your father was, not because of the connections, not because of bribes you've made to government officials, but you can come, you can do this. And that's what attracts people to come here. Why do you think there's so many issues in Egypt? Because in Egypt, if you're not wealthy, if your father is not a wealthy person, you're not going to succeed in Egyptian society because it takes, money, bribes, and connections. I'm not saying there aren't connections don't help you here. Of course they do.
Obviously.
But the fact that, I, as someone whose parents were factory workers, can be a professor. My sister can be an engineer. There's nothing to say that, your people are factory workers and you have to stay in this situation. You can go to school, you can get an education, you can better yourself, you can get a great job and provide a better life for your family than your parents, had. That's the American dream. And that's where Muslims are really living that out.
Do you think, something I'd like to ask that's slightly more provocative, because there can be a way in which people that have our political allegiances or intellectual training, right? Years of reading books and traveling and interacting with people of diverse cultural backgrounds. There's a way in which we can inoculate every ideology and make every idea something that you can sort of try on or take off. What would you say, if anything, and maybe nothing, demarcates American Muslims as a community? Would you say that is there a binding force to what it means to identify with being an American Muslim?
Yeah, so I think at a basic level, sure there is. And I think that's at some level a connection to the Quran as scripture, at some level, founding idea of the story of the Prophet Muhammad and where that comes in. How that's lived out is completely different in the same way that for American Christians, what's important? Well, Jesus' life. But do you see Jesus as a socialist? Do you see Jesus as a capitalist? All sorts of different ways of seeing Jesus. I teach in a Catholic Jesuit university. The Catholic worker movement has a very different understanding of who Jesus was than the Opus Dei movement does. It's that kind of thing. But at some level, sure, for Christians, there's a connection to Jesus and the Bible. At some level, for Muslims, there's a connection to the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. But so many different ways of living that out. And again, that's one of the nice things about being here in this country. There's no official state version of Islam. There's nothing that says that to be a Muslim means to be a Sunni Muslim, that Shia Muslims aren't welcome, that Ismaili Muslims aren't welcome, that Ahmadiyya Muslims aren't welcome. I was born in Pakistan. In Pakistan, as of about 1974, the Ahmadiyya community, which is sort of a heterodox community, was officially prescribed against. You couldn't be an Ahmadi and call yourself a Muslim. They were persecuted. They're still persecuted, unfortunately. Best case scenario, they're seen as this heterodox sort of community because of the ideas of their founder, a guy named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad.
For our viewers that are not aware of what distinguishes them, what are some of the common elements that would cause them to be heterodox?
So the Ahmadiyya community is named after their founder, a man named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who sort of radically reinterpreted the tradition, saw himself not just as a reformer, but as a prophet after the prophet. And so for Muslims, like, wait a minute, prophethood ends with the Prophet Muhammad.
Seal of the prophet.
Exactly, he's a seal of the prophets. There are no prophets after him. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad connected himself also with Hindu communities, Christian communities, that kind of thing. And so the ways in which interpretation of the text, meaning the Quran, the way in which authority takes place is a little bit different. But for me, the key is that in Pakistan, the Ahmadiyya can't call themselves Muslims legally because of Pakistani laws. Here, there's no law that says in order to be a Muslim, you have to fit into this particular box. I mean, think of Christianity. Think of Christian worship service, from Quaker meetings to Appalachian, snake handling, to high mass, to a Methodist service. Completely different ways of doing it. There's nothing that says that this is a Protestant country or this is a Catholic country. Now, in the past, we clearly had those kinds of tensions. And here in California, it's sort of interesting because California is more Catholic than Protestant, different than the rest of the United States, which is more Protestant than Catholic. But all this to say that precisely because there's no official state definition, precisely because the state doesn't say, we will define who Muslims are. Muslims are free to live out their lives as Sunni Muslims in the way that I do, as Shia Muslims, as Ismaili Shia Muslims, as Ahmadiyya Muslims. You have all sorts of LGBTQ positive Muslim groups here in America, whereas in other parts of the Muslim world you would say, well, how can you do that? You can't be gay and be a Muslim. That's impossible. Here you've got gay Muslims saying, yeah, but we are here, and we are Muslim, and we're able to do that.
It reminds me of something Alexis de Tocqueville remarked on when he is sort of talking about kind of religiosity in America, and he talks about the fact that there is no state religion in America actually frees Americans to be as religious as they are wont to be.
Absolutely.
And there is, one of the things that about, as you pointed out, America is off the charts as far as when it comes to our religiosity, our affiliations with religion, our verve with which we participate in our religions or spiritualities or whatever the case may be. And so it seems a very natural fit. Islam, to me, right, given clearly I have a different background than probably, or a different training, not a different background, but a different training than most people that might be interested in, what does Islam intend for America or something like that. But the fact that you would have thriving, vibrant Islamic communities of all stripes in the United States does not strike me as strange at all. Right. It puts me sort of out of step at times with what passes for public discourse on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. I hear people talking about things in a way that strikes me as altogether strange and out of step with what I identify with as being American. Right. And so one of the things that I loved about the book was the number of examples from varieties of walks of life in which Muslims had significant influence and impact on being American, not being Muslim, but being understanding what it means to be American. Is there anything that, like, when you were researching the book or thinking about the book, I know it took you a while to get around to writing it. You mentioned that in the preface, that you were working on a lot of other research projects.
Well, and the book came out in 2016, but it really had nothing to do with the election cycle in 2016. The genesis of the book came out in 2009 when President Obama, in one of his first speeches as president outside the U.S., was at Cairo University, so in Egypt, and he's talking about the connection of America and Islam. And he talks about the ways, and this is 2009, the ways in which American Muslims have enriched America. He talks about they've lit the Olympic torch, they've built our tallest building, they've won Nobel Prizes, and I'm thinking, I bet most Americans don't know that. I bet most Americans don't know. They probably know he's talking about, when they talk about lit the Olympic torch, they're talking about Muhammad Ali. They probably don't know when he's talking about one Nobel Prize of Ahmed Zewail, this chemist, who taught until his death at Caltech. They're probably not aware of Fazlur Rahman Khan, the Bangladeshi structural engineer who helped build these tall buildings like the Sears Tower, like the John Hancock Building. We don't think of those kinds of contributions. And that leads to some interesting kinds of things. So the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life does really good work on religion and public life. 62% of Americans, when asked, will say, I don't know a Muslim. And I write about this in the book, that it's kind of like with the LGBTQ community, where people say, I don't know a gay person. It's like, no, you know a gay person. You just don't know that they're gay.
That's
you know?
right. That's right.
You
They
know
don't have a
someone who's-
T-shirt
well,
that
but
says
that's
that.
what I mean.
Right.
You know someone who's a Muslim. You just don't know that they're Muslim, because chances are they're your doctor. Chances are they're your kid's teacher. Chances are that they're a guy that owns the business next door to you. And that's precisely it, the sort of ordinariness of Islam in America. But part of it is also, we know, and this is, I think human beings are sort of guilty of this, we know in our own communities where we differ. We know, for example, if we're Catholic, that we're more Catholic worker Catholic than Opus Dei Catholic, or we're Vietnamese Catholic as opposed to, German Catholic or Irish Catholic. But we assume that everyone else is exactly A, the same, and B, different from us. And so that was not something I wrote about in this book, but I moved here over 20 years ago. I moved in 1997 to Los Angeles. I was ignorant of the situation in Los Angeles. I knew that there were a lot of Spanish speakers here. I naively assumed that all the Spanish speakers in LA were connected to Mexico. And you're very nicely disabused of that when you come here going, yeah, there's some folks from Mexico who speak Spanish, but there's some folks from Cuba and from Texas and Salvador and Guatemala
Costa
and
Rica,
Argentina and Costa Rica and Puerto Rico and all those kinds of things that not all Spanish speakers in Los Angeles have a
Yeah, the
connection
Spaniards
with Mexico.
made their way around when they were colonizing
But it's
the
that
Americas.
kind of thing, and I think that ignorance in and of itself is not a bad thing. Like I'm an academic. If it wasn't for ignorance, I'd be out of a job. So
absolutely.
And I'm saying that I was ignorant when I came here. I didn't know the complexities of Spanish speakers, in Southern California. We shouldn't be surprised that people don't know the complexity of Muslim communities. What's an American Muslim look like? Well, at least a quarter of us are African American. A third of us are South Asian. A third of us are Middle Eastern, and Middle Eastern could mean Arab or could mean Iranian, especially in this town. And so all sorts of differences there in terms of literally what we look like, the languages we speak, the dress we wear, the customs, the habits that we have. But we don't think about that. We think of this monolithic community as if someone like me, born in Pakistan, as if someone like Muhammad Ali, born in Louisville, Kentucky, as if someone like, one of the imams, for example, here in Santa Ana, is from the Cham community, this community that came out of the Cambodia-Laos sort of area. Completely different backgrounds, what we look like, what we talk like, how we dress, and yet we're all Muslim.
Right. Seth Stephen Davidowitz recently wrote a book called Everybody Lies, and one of the anecdotes in the book is his research is around using Google as a barometer for people's opinions. How do search terms move based on this cultural event, this speech, whatever it is? And one of the things that he found in his research was that he specifically references speeches given by President Obama, that provoking curiosity was a far stronger indicator of moving people's opinions in a positive direction than homilizing to them. By that I mean telling them what's right, what's wrong, about how they should live their lives. And so provoking their curiosity about the number of Muslims in American society, the number of Muslims in American history, the ways in which these very large communities that we tend to speak about in bars, on TV shows, Latin Americans, Americans, Muslims, these large sweeping, millions, hundreds of millions, in the case of Islam, 1 billion human beings, to talk about them in such flat terms, of course provokes anxiety. You're surrounded by 1 billion people. You don't know what they believe. Whether you were doing it intentionally or not, I'm not sure, but in the book, clearly one of the things you're doing is provoking curiosity, right? Look at the number of ways that undoubtedly you have interacted with American culture. Music, entertainment, sports. Muslims have had powerful impacts on those cultural productions, provoking curiosity.
Absolutely.
not flattening out these descriptions. Is there anything that, I mean, if you were to sort of, if you had the ability to sort of sit on a major media stage and reorganize the pieces and how people are talking about Islam today in the world, what changes would you make?
Well, and I think it's the ordinariness of Muslims, and this is something that I talk to Muslims about when I'm speaking to Muslim audiences, to say, look, you know, it's a trope, but it's true. Muslim mothers are Jewish mothers. You know, we want our children to succeed. Success means you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an engineer, you're a business owner, and there is no other option. You know, when I speak to Muslim audiences, I say we have enough Muslim doctors, we have enough Muslim engineers. We need Muslim newscasters. We need Muslim storytellers. Like last year, 2017 was this amazing year for American Muslims. You start with Mahershala winning Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, American Muslim. Kumail Nanjiani with sort of the breakout rom-com, The Big Sick. Aziz Ansari winning a number of Emmys for Master of None. I think that's what changes the narrative. You know, do you see Muslims as contributors to American society? Do you look at a Dave Chappelle and think, yeah, that guy really changed the face of comedy in America in the 21st century with Chappelle's show, and I'm really glad he's back doing the stand-up. And then you think, oh, by the way, that guy's a Muslim. That's an American Muslim. None of the characters on Chappelle's show were Muslims, and yet here's this guy who's really changed things. I think that's really the key, that we don't think about that. We don't pay attention to the varieties of being Muslim, even though we know the varieties of being an American. You know, forget about being an American. There's differences between Los Angeles and San Diego. There's certainly differences between, you know, Los Angeles and San Francisco. That's just within California. Forget about the differences between, you know, California and Texas, between Texas and Florida, between Florida and New York, between New York and Oregon. You know, we know that we have this vast, diverse country, that the people are different, the way in which we talk, the foods we eat are different. We don't generalize that to other communities and realize that American Muslims are just as diverse. And so part of it with the media is this idea that, look, I'm not asking that, you know, you make the next superhero or the next, you know, action hero or the next hero of your film a Muslim. I am probably asking, maybe you don't make the next villain a Muslim, but just the ordinariness. I mean, this goes back to the ordinariness of Islam in America. That I once spoke at a small place in Iowa, and someone said, you know, we'd love to do some dialogue with Muslims, but there's no mosque in this town. You know, the closest mosque is, you know, 2.5 or 2 hours away. And I said, well, that's interesting, but, you know, when I was driving in here, I saw a hospital. There's a hospital in town? Yes, there is. Does this town have a chamber of commerce? Yes, it does. Well, maybe you should go to the Chamber of Commerce and see if there's some Muslims who own businesses. Maybe you should go to the hospital and see if there's some Muslim doctors there, because of course you don't think of the hospital as a place to meet Muslims, even though there's Muslim doctors there. You know, one of my favorite television shows really in recent years was Community, you know, with Joel McHale.
First 3 seasons were great.
Well,
it went
went
downhill
show,
after that, but
I love Dan Harmon stuff. But, you know, Danny Pudi plays this character Abed Nadir, who's sort of half Palestinian, half Polish, which is actually, I mean, Danny's background is Indian and Polish. And they play with that because, of course, his father on the show is Iqbal Thiba, who's, you know, Pakistani. And so it's like, wait a minute, I get what you're doing here. Because, of course, the average American can't distinguish between Palestine and Pakistan, who thinks that Pakistanis are Arabs in the way that Palestinians are. You know, Pakistanis are Asians, they're not Arab. But where I'm going with this is that I think there's like about 3 episodes of Community where there's specific things about Abed being a Muslim. The rest of the time, he's just a college student who's sort of on the spectrum, trying to get through life. That's American Muslims. That's the sort of ordinariness of it. So I love a show like that where the Muslim character isn't the Muslim character who 24/7 is the Muslim character. He happens to be Muslim, just like Shirley happens to be a sort of, you know, conservative Christian. But that's not, you know, every show doesn't revolve around her brand of Christianity, just like every show doesn't revolve around Abed's, Islam. But I think that's the key. You're going to do a show about universities, have some Muslims there. You're going to do a medical drama, have a Muslim doctor there. I mean, that's the first portrayal, the first regular Muslim character on American television was actually a British actor, Eamon Walker, playing Kareem Saeed on Oz. And that was Tom Fontana. I mean, Tom Fontana had done all these, wonderful cop shows. And he talks about this where, the cop show ends where the bad guy goes to prison. So for him, the natural thing was, okay, so what happens when prison happens? And so he does Oz, which was HBO's first real drama series. Before The Sopranos, they did Oz,
I remember.
And so here's Tom Fontana doing this thing about prisons, and he didn't set out to say, let me talk about Muslims in prison, but if you're talking about prisons, there's the archaeology. If you want to survive in prison, you got to join a gang. White Aryan nation, Latino mafia, mafia, black Muslims. And so you have this character that Eamon Walker plays, Kareem Saeed, the leader of the black Muslims. And so here's the first regular Muslim character on American television because it reflects a reality. This goes back to your original question that we don't like to think about. We don't like to talk about prisons, even though we have the most people in prisons of any country in the world. Can you understand American prisons without the Muslim component of prisoners' spirituality? That's really important.
Do you think, I actually have two questions, and they're very different, so you can answer them in either order. One, did they find Muslims in the community in Iowa when you went to speak there in the hospitals? And two, more expansively, do you think that there is anything about Islam and its mythology, its narrative, its story about itself, that lends itself to a inspirational story about what it means to be on the margins of American society and contribute to it positively and not in a purely sort of destructive, aggressive, and destructive way?
Absolutely. So, to answer your first question, the answer was yes. Yeah, there actually was a Muslim doctor
Unsurprisingly,
in the hospital.
no, sure, right.
But part of it, and you can see where people are coming from because you're talking about Muslims in numbers. So yeah, there is no mosque, and the doctor talked about the fact that the nearest mosque is 2 hours away, so you have to make arrangements for what you're able to do there. But to your other question about the sort of narrative, both for Muslims in America, I think it fits really well that you'd asked me a question earlier about the sort of connections that all Muslims have, and one of them I think is to the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And we all understand that life differently, but it's a life of hardship and struggle. Like here's a man whose father dies before he's born. He's born in a tribal society in Arabia in the 7th century where who your father is quite important. I mean, forget about 7th century Arabia. Think about 21st century America. To be born without a father puts you at a significant disadvantage.
Absolutely.
There. His mother dies when he's 6. He's raised by his grandfather, who dies when the boy is 8. At the age of 8, he's raised by his uncle. And so the hardship, what's it mean to never know your father? What's it mean to lose your mother at 6? What's it mean to be adopted by your uncle, when you're 8 years old? But then you grow up, you become a businessman, because that's what your uncle does. He's involved in the caravan trade just like your father was. And so that story of Muhammad, I think, resonates with Muslims precisely, A, because it's a human story, and B, it's a human story that deals with diversity, that deals with struggle. He's not born to the palace. He's not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's got to struggle. He's got to work. He's got to, come up to this. The challenges that he faces, because he preaches monotheism in a society that's polytheistic, very similar to Jesus. The kind of message that Jesus preaches isn't readily, quickly adapted. It takes generations for Christianity to become this, dominant tradition, the same way that it takes for Islam. But for me, that, to your question, is that for American Muslims, it's that model that is the American model. Because what's the American model? But you work hard, you succeed, you deal with triumph. To use a line from boxing and Ali, it's not whether you get knocked down. You're going to get knocked down as a boxer. You're going to get knocked down as an American. Do you get back up? Isn't that what defines you as an American? Do you get back up? Do you get back up? Do you keep fighting despite the struggles? You succeed. You look at, everyone and their dog talks about Steve Jobs as this great sort of visionary leader. Well, we forget that Steve got fired, by
Absolutely.
Apple because folks weren't happy with the direction he was taking the company in. It's those kinds
He
of
needed a loan
things.
from Microsoft,
Well,
actually.
but it's that kind of thing. We don't think about that idea. We sort of lionize the person and lionize the company, but don't pay attention to the history. But for me, that's that idea that to be a Muslim in many ways, is to be a good American. Like you look at the fact that what was the Prophet Muhammad's sort of career before he was a prophet? He was a businessman. What's America but about business
Yes.
and sort of the capitalist sort of element there in American society dovetails with Muslim society.
Do you, and now this is, so for those of our watchers that are not steeped in academic lore, this may sound strange to them, but certainly amongst a certain segment of the academy,
Right.
PhDs, people that are professors, there is a deep suspicion of capitalism
Right.
and the history of capitalism. And you just, in an off-the-cuff way, mentioned it in a positive light next to a deeply, 1,400-year-old spiritual tradition. Do you think that there is anything that Islam in itself as a practice, as an orientation towards the world,
Right.
is particularly consonant with American capitalism, or do you buy the argument that capitalism is somehow kind of a human innovation that taps into a kind of our natural proclivities for selfishness, for self, and I don't mean selfishness in some kind of awful venal
Right.
way, but just in the way that like you want your family to prosper, you want
Absolutely.
your community to prosper.
Absolutely. No, and I think there is that sort of correlation with Islam precisely because of the Prophet Muhammad's background, that his father and his uncle worked in the caravan trade. They were business people. They bought and sold goods, and that was important. I think the danger, and this is a danger that all religious folks share with capitalism, isn't capitalism qua capitalism in and of itself. It's the excesses of it. Do you now try to acquire all the capital? Do you try to acquire all the money? Do you see it as a zero-sum game? Do you believe that you have an obligation to the poor? And so I think that's the kind of
Drink
thing
up
there
everyone's milkshake.
well,
Daniel
exactly,
Day-Lewis.
exactly.
Yeah.
But it's that idea that one of the pillars of Islam, zakat, literally means purification. We talk about it as charity. Wealth is not a bad thing for Muslims. To accumulate wealth is not a bad thing because everything comes from God. But to hoard wealth, and there's a difference. Maybe that's the difference between accumulating wealth and becoming wealthy, and hoarding it and wanting the money and only the money and not seeing that connection to the people around you. So you have to, if you have wealth, you have to give some of that wealth to those who don't. You have an obligation to the people around you. That's no different, I think, than Christian notions, for example, of tithing, that you have to take care of people.
This is Scrooge. This is the idea. This
Absolutely.
is the Christmas Carol, right?
Absolutely.
You've done all of these good, not good works, but diligent works over the history of your life, and keeping them all for yourself and not giving them to Bob McCratchit to actually distribute to the community is what the error is, not the success.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And that to be wealthy is not a bad thing. Most of us aspire to that. I grew up working class poor. I love the fact that I'm no longer working class poor. Am I a capitalist? Yes, I am. I have a 401k. I'd like to retire at some point. That's an important, kind of thing. Does that mean though that I pursue wealth at all costs? Well, of course not. If I want to do that, I would have gone into investment banking, rather than academia. I see myself as a teacher.
Right.
So I think for a lot of American Muslims, there's exactly that kind of thing. You go into professions, you value education, you go to school, you send your kids to school, whether they're boys or girls. There's nothing that says, no, we don't want young women to go to university. We want young women to stay at home and have families. No, you send your boys, you send your girls to school. There's that's importance of education. There's that sense of building a career, doing those kinds of things. I think that's important.
A two-part question. What you just said recalled something for me. I know in the Baha'i faith that it is the primary responsibility to educate women because they have the primary responsibility of educating the children.
Right.
Obviously, the Baha'i faith is,
Sure.
from some points of view, seen as a heterodox aspect of Islam. Does Islam are there traditions within Islam that see the same responsibility of the woman to educate the children? Secondly, a lot of the way that Islam is spoken about and
Sure.
criticized in everyday discussions on the news,
Right.
talking head interviews, is its a lack of commitment to education opportunities for women.
Right.
Could you speak about, one, specifically the
Sure.
first question, secondly, your impression
Yeah.
of that criticism?
No, and I think that criticism is a fair criticism in certain parts of the world, but that's where America, meaning American Muslims, really can take the lead. Because for American Muslims, I could say this across the board, having looked at, Sunni groups, Shia groups, Ismaili Shia groups, Ahmadiyya groups, there's nothing that prevents American Muslims from sending boys and girls to get higher education. And by that I mean not just high school, but university, typically professional, graduate, to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, that kind of thing. And I think that is different from other places, where there's more of a push for the women's role to be more in the house, that kind of thing. In Canada, 40 years ago now, you had a thing called the Canadian Council of Muslim Women that was founded mostly by Muslim women who had Christian and Jewish women friends who had their sort of, Jewish feminist groups or Christian feminist groups. And they were thinking, how come we don't have a maybe we should have a Muslim women's group. Well, a couple of decades later in Egypt, you have the Egyptians saying, well, wait a minute, the Canadian Muslims have a Canadian Muslim women's group. Maybe we should have an Egyptian Muslim women's group. So you have these really interesting ways in which, we tend to think of North American Islam as only being influenced by Islam from around the world and not the other way.
Absolutely.
That we can do things that can influence countries of origin. So for example, and I'm coming back to your question in a minute, but so for example, I teach at Loyola Marymont University, Jesuit university. We've got a couple hundred Muslim students, about 2/3 of whom are international students, many of whom come from Kuwait, from the Emirates, from the Gulf countries. They come here, they may encounter for the first time a Jewish teacher. They may encounter for the first time our rabbi, because we have a Hillel on campus. They're forced to rethink what they may have been taught about other traditions, about, rights and privileges, that kind of thing. And then they go back to their places, and that's where they transform them. So, in really interesting ways, Americans, one of the things, let me start that again, one of the things that America is leading the world in is education. Anyone's list of the top 10 universities in the world will have at least 5 or 6 American universities.
Absolutely. Yeah.
People send their kids from all over the world to America for universities, including Muslim parents from, Muslim majority countries. Some of those people go back to those countries. So there's that part. I think to your point about feminism and women, there certainly is a value placed on mothers primarily, because who are our first teachers? Our mothers. There's a wonderful hadith, a saying of the Prophet, where a man comes to the Prophet and says, among all people, who is the one, most worthy of my respect? And the Prophet says, your mother. And then the man says, okay, well, after my mother, who is the most worthy of respect? The Prophet says, your mother. And the man says, okay, but after my mother, who is the most worthy of respect? The Prophet says, your mother, and then your father. The idea of the importance of the mother over the father is crucial. And you see across the Muslim world, oftentimes when you have gender segregated societies, that paradoxically creates opportunities for women. If you've got women who are to see women doctors, if you are to have, women judges trying cases that involve women, then you have to develop a system of having women judges, of having women doctors. The medical faculties in most Muslim majority countries tend to have more women tenured than the medical faculties of North American. It's really interesting kinds of things. So on the one hand, we can say that, there are huge problems with the status of women in the Muslim world. And in many cases, there in fact are problems,
Sure, of course
but it's not a universal kind of thing. Then we look at certain other measures to say, okay, so the countries with the most Muslims, numerically, Indonesia is the country with the most Muslims. Then it's probably Pakistan. Then it's probably India. Then it's probably Bangladesh. Those 4 countries make up half of the world's Muslims. All 4 of those countries have had women as leaders. Our country hasn't had a woman as a leader. I grew up in Canada. Kim Campbell was prime minister, but she wasn't elected. She became prime minister because the prime minister was sort of, kicked out of office, Brian Mulroney, and she, got brought in, but she didn't win the next election. So Canada or the U.S. have not elected a woman as leader. Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, not, progressive, liberal sort of places have elected women as leaders. So it's really interesting, kinds of
Yeah,
things.
one of the things that I feel like people, sort of, Sam Harris comes to mind, Bill Maher comes to mind, even though I'm sympathetic to some of their arguments and some of the positions they take, particularly in relation to kind of the simplifications that'll often happen on the left about different cultures. Is it seems to me that you can literally wear any worldview, Islam, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, fill in the blank, American, Iraqi, fill in the blank, to justify existing iniquities.
Absolutely.
You pick any of them. I don't mean that the positions are without content, right? Of course, that's not the case. But that, in fact, what you're talking about are enormous historical pressures which organize people into hierarchies, gender hierarchies, racial hierarchies, sectarian hierarchies. And that it's not actually Islam, Christianity, America, capitalism, whatever, that are imposing these structures. It's that these stories are explanations for structures that are in place for a variety of reasons, some of which are those traditions, some of which are the fault of Christianity, some of which are the fault of capital. But that, again, we go back to my earlier question and why I appreciated the book, the flattening of all of that, as if there is any one tradition in the world that can be blamed for the vast injustices that human beings have perpetrated on one another. And so you listed a number of Muslim countries in which women are, you said their representation on medical faculties tends to be higher because of probably issues of modesty and exposure between the sexes. And
You didn't have women doctors to work on women patients, which means you have to train women doctors.
Yeah, right, absolutely, judgeships and whatnot. Do you, in your background as a scholar, your numbers of years teaching, I mean, you've been in the United States now for 95, you said, I think?
97.
Okay, so 97. So almost a little over 20 years, actually. Do you see any kind of trajectory to the culture in America, Canada, in the West in general, globally? Is the current turn, which, I mean, we have to acknowledge that there is definitely a turn in the rhetoric right now. Is the current turn, in your view, anomalous? Or is it a dangerous return to a kind of tribalism?
Yeah, and so I think the current turn is not unexpected. I mean, where it's dangerous, of course, is, especially here in the United States, is where that gets political power. You know, the fact that President Trump surrounds himself with folks who are openly hostile to Islam. You know, Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, now still Stephen Miller, Michael Flynn, who lasted for 2 weeks. Talked about Islam not being a religion but being an ideology, that kind of stuff. So that becomes part of the problem. But that's not unique to America. You see that happening in Britain. You see that happening in Canada. I think part of the reason you see it happening is precisely the sort of demographic shift. And so I was born in Pakistan. I came to Canada in 1970. In Toronto in 1970, there was one mosque. In Canada in 1970, there were probably about 35,000 Muslims. When I left Toronto in 1997, there were over 30 mosques in the city. The last National Household Census in Canada in 2011 counted over 1 million Canadian Muslims.
Wow, that's dramatic.
Yeah,
it's dramatic.
It's dramatic, but it's still tiny compared to the 35 million Canadians. And so where I'm going with this is you hear those kinds of stories that, Muslims are going to take over, or American Muslims within 10 years are going to be able to elect an American Muslim president who's going to bring in Sharia law. Exactly. And that's just not going to happen, first of all, just in terms of the numbers. But if you see those kinds of things, if you see the kind of shifts that have taken place, so for example, a couple of years ago, my parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, and I was there, and I talked to a woman who's one of my mom's oldest friends, who met my mom, I think, in like 1973 or something. And I said to this woman, if she was a Sikh woman, so I don't think I know the story. How did you meet my mom? And she says, well, it's an interesting story. Your sister, I have a younger sister, was in the hospital, and your mom was, there in the hospital, and she was, waiting out front because, they were doing a procedure on your sister. And I and my husband were walking across the street on the other side, and we were speaking Punjabi. And your mom was so excited to hear that language that she literally went across the street to say hello. And so this is my mother in 1973 who hasn't heard her native tongue, Punjabi, in 3 years, other than, like in the house with Urdu, to see this woman rush across the street. Fast forward 40 years, and Hockey Night in Canada, Canadian institution, now has a Punjabi language broadcast where you can hear Hockey Night in Canada in Punjabi. That was unthinkable in 1970. Where I'm going with this is I think that's precisely the kind of issue that creates the tensions and the problems. If you're part of the dominant culture where everyone in positions of power has always looked like you, and now all of a sudden you're seeing people who don't look like you, who are in positions of power, who are in positions of authority. The American president, for the first time, is an African American person. He's half white, but we don't talk about that part. We don't call him the first biracial president. We call him the first African American. Again, that flattening out of things there. That creates some tension for some folks. That creates excitement for other folks. You talk to elementary school teachers and the excitement that kids had looking at that list of white faces, and then they get to that one black face. Oh, I could grow up to be president. Now, think about little girls who don't see a girl's face there. Can I grow up to be president? There. So I think that's really the issue here, that we are seeing that kind of turn, not just in the United States, in Canada. Canada had Stephen Harper as prime minister. No particular, friend of Muslims or multicultural societies, that kind of thing there. So it's not like, it's a unique problem here. The problem here, of course, is, the American president has extraordinary power because America is the most powerful country in the world. But I think that sense of, for some folks, it is a threat to see people who don't look like you and to begin to think that maybe they can be taking over, which is not going to happen. The dominant culture is still the dominant culture. But in a funny way, I think that's part of the history of America. Like I read in the book, I have no doubt that American Muslims were not interred post 9/11 precisely because Japanese Americans were interred post Pearl Harbor. And we learned from that, not the least of which was through the struggle of Japanese Americans say, wait a minute, this was wrong. You knew that we were loyal citizens, not enemy agents of the Emperor of Japan. And you put us away anyway. You took our homes, you took our lands, you disrupted our lives. They were really key in reaching out to American Muslims post 9/11. So I guess where I'm going with this is that history of groups, and there's still pain there. You look at African Americans, you look at calls for reparations, you look at issues there, and there's folks that don't want to address that. We don't want to talk about that kind of thing. You look at First Nations, Native peoples. We don't want to talk about what we did to Native populations, here, and yet we did those kinds of things. So I think part of it is that, do we acknowledge, what we've done? Do we move forward, and do we bring in people who want to join with us?
Right.
Because that's really the key. That to be an American, first and foremost, when I became a U.S. citizen, what did I do? I swore an oath to defend the Constitution. That's the allegiance, is to this document, not to this king, not to this ruler, not to this political party, to this piece of paper, the Constitution. And for American Muslims, there's no difficulty in having that kind of allegiance, precisely because what's the First Amendment give us? Freedom of religion. That this is a place where you can practice your religion freely without being persecuted.
Yeah, there is a way in which, in my experience of America, that this reluctance to acknowledge, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, our darker parts, as in every other thing in life, only causes it to fester, right? It only causes it to be more powerful.
Absolutely.
The thing that you deny then has power over that denial, right? And then you have to go to greater and greater lengths to deny that this has any impact on who you are as a person or a people, depending on your frame of reference. And so our inability to deal soberly with kind of the devastation of slavery, the brutality of westward expansion, leads to these things coming around over and over and over again. There is essentially, I mean, as much as you know, I very much consider myself a defender and booster for the American idea. I believe in those ideas of equality and even the pursuit of happiness, if you reach back to happiness in the sort of Greek sense of flourishing and you kind of eudaimon or whatever, like the sort of the power to kind of realize whatever it is your particular contribution to life is. But the aspect of being an American today, and has been the case for the last 100 years, this sort of steadfast, stubborn denial of our history, seems to me that it makes it difficult for us to come to terms with pretty ordinary things in the history of the world, right? Looking at people that are different than us, casting suspicion, aspersions on them, is pretty standard. It's not a positive thing, it's something to be dealt with and overcome. And just as you said, like, part of the reason that it was less of an issue, though still an issue, post 9/11 is what Japanese Americans went through. What do you think it is about, so I mean, you came from Canada, so you would still, in some ways, you're going to have a more critical eye on what it is to be an American that I may not see as being an American. What is it particularly about Americans and our way of comporting ourselves to the world that makes it so difficult for us to deal with the uglier parts of our history?
Yeah. I think the real thing there is when you're the most powerful country in the world, you often don't realize just how powerful you are and what your relationships with others. So as a Canadian, I made a conscious decision to become an American citizen, in 2013. And that was coming from Canada. It's not like I'm coming from a war-torn, desolate, country, all that kind of thing. Canada's a lovely place to be. And the fact that I can be a dual citizen, I would not give up Canadian citizenship, but I don't need to be an American, And there's something quite powerful to me about the Constitution, about the sort of values that represents. And so wanting to say, yeah, I don't just live here. I want part of this
The ownership
American dream. I want ownership of this, so you become a U.S. citizen. And I think that's no different than the generations who've come before me to have become citizens. I think that's the key, that, it took generations for Jews to become accepted. I have Jewish friends who have some examples of covenants from the 1960s where, you will not rent to Jews, you will not sell your house to Jews. This is the 1960s, not the 1860s. The same thing with African Americans. I know African American folks who were the first African Americans in their neighborhoods, and the fight that the neighbors had with the guy that sold them that.
The city of Claremont, where I got my PhD, had basically an unwritten practice of not showing homes to African Americans until like 82 or something. I mean, this was like last week. I mean, it's amazing.
This is not the 1880s after Civil War.
This
is the 1980s. But that's where I'm going with this, is that we have that history. People have overcome those kinds of obstacles. Jews become accepted as Americans. Catholics become accepted as Americans. If you had the time machine and could go back to the Continental Congress and say, in about 250 years, most Supreme Court judges are going to be either Jews or Catholics. They would have said, this is crazy. Who are you? This is crazy talk. Jews and Catholics on the Supreme Court, that'll never happen. Well, the majority of the Supreme Court justices are either Jews or Catholics, And so you make those kinds of shifts. For some of us, it's still hard. Chinese Americans, given the kind of issue that's going on with China economically, that's the big thing now. And I think that's part of the fear that I grew up in the 70s with the Cold War and the fear of the Russians. Then it was sort of the fear of Muslims, post 9/11. Now it's kind of the fear of Chinese in terms of, the real big kid on the block. But to your point, I think when you come from a dominant culture, you don't realize your impact on other cultures. You don't pay attention to them. You know, the Prime Minister in Canada, Justin Trudeau, his father was, you know, Prime Minister before him, Pierre Trudeau, and Pierre made a very funny and very insightful comment. He said, you know, the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is like an elephant being in bed with a mouse. The mouse is much more concerned about the elephant than the elephant is concerned about the mouse. You know, we, meaning in Canada, learn American history. We learn American geography. We have to, because America is the most powerful country in the world. Americans don't have to learn about anything other than America. And I think that's where sometimes you shut out the kind of learning. You don't pay attention to those kinds of things. You forget the struggle it took for, you know, Jews to become accepted in this country, for Catholics to become accepted in this country. The struggle now with Latinos. You know, when Mr. Trump was campaigning, there were sort of two groups of people that he was sort of maligning. It was Muslims and Mexicans, you know. And so you see that kind of thing. And of course here meaning in Southern California, we have a lot of folks who have connections to Mexico. That creates all sorts of problems. That creates all sorts of, you know, tensions there.
So going back to so blip in sort of the current climate, the current rhetoric surrounding other people, a blip in American history, or a dangerous trend?
So I think it's something in between that. I don't think it's a blip, because I think it'll last for a while. I don't see it as a dangerous trend, and for me, there's a fundamental hope. Like I think I'm an academic, I'm a teacher. You know, you don't go into teaching if you're not hopeful. You know, you have to have some hope there. And so for me, it's precisely that idea that you learn from this, that people understand that, no, wait, American Muslims are good Americans. I know my doctor, I know my son's teacher, I know the guy that runs the business next door to me. He's a decent guy, he's a nice guy, he's not out to try and change my way of life. He in fact values that. I think that's the key, that recognition that American Muslims are good Americans. That's a weird idea for a lot of folks to get their head around, but that's the reality of the world.
Yeah, it reminds me of something the anthropologist Scott Atran, who he has done he's done a lot of work in Islamic communities internationally, and studied terrorism and the rest of it. And one of the things that he talks about is, you know, this idea of like the golden rule, the silver rule, whatever, you know, do unto others.
Right.
That what it looks like cross-culturally is that large communities of strangers, so, you know, Islam, America, China, anywhere where you are unlikely to, or not only unlikely, it is impossible to know all the other people that you are identifying with as a group, seem to operate on the golden rule, do unto others. But cross-culturally, we believe that that is not how other communities operate.
Right.
We don't think that the Chinese believe that you should more or less do unto others.
Right.
We don't believe that Muslims, even though obviously based on this conversation and just if you are paying attention, it makes no sense to talk about Muslims as a single corporate body. But that if there is something in common, that probably they believe you should do unto others as you would have do unto you. But that we have such a difficult time extending our imaginations to people that look differently, from speak different languages, eat differently, prepare their foods differently, dress differently. It's confounding.
Absolutely, and it's particularly confounding, I would add to that, in a land that is a land of immigrants. That's really the key here. It'd be one thing if we came from a society where everyone looked like us, talked like us, was from the same racial group or religious group.
Sweden,
Sweden, exactly those kinds of places, like, you know. But that's not America. America, by definition, is what? A land of immigrants. And so you have that kind of thing. Part of it is, I think, people simply don't know the realities of American Muslim life. Where I'm going with this is, I had an uncle who moved to Houston about a decade ago. He was an engineer from New Jersey, actually, Pakistani. You know, had moved from Pakistan to New Jersey, worked in DuPont, you know, the chemical company. And DuPont had moved him from Jersey to Houston. He actually worked on marine paints, and so, you know, you're looking at that kind of world. And he's moving from New Jersey, which is, you know, the area that he lived in was heavily South Asian, you know, kind of thing, to Houston, to this suburb near where he worked, that was mostly, you know, white and Baptist. And he called me up and said, okay, I'm moving to this place, what do I do? Like, they're all going to think I'm this, crazy foreigner, terrorist kind of thing. I'm like, nah, don't worry about it. Just introduce yourself to your neighbors. He's like, what are you talking about? And he goes, trust me, introduce yourself to your neighbors. I don't know why he took my advice. He actually introduced himself to his neighbors. And at first they were reluctant because here's this brown Pakistani Muslim man who, speaks with a, Pakistani accent, and they were a little leery. But then they began to understand that this was a religious man. This was a man who didn't drink. This was a man who prayed regularly. This was a man who actually had conservative social values. American Muslims tend to be, again, on the whole, more conservative than other groups of Americans. So if you look at support for gay marriage, for example, it enjoys less support among American Muslims as a whole than it does, let's say, among American Christians. But going back to my uncle,
what about Catholics? Just do you know, out of curiosity? I mean, I'm curious. Do you know what the support is amongst Catholics?
I actually don't know there.
Okay.
My suspicion is that because roughly speaking, if you're looking at American Muslims, the support is depending on where you are, of course, between 40 and 60%. And so, at peak, it's about 60%. Among Americans in general, for things like gay marriage, is closer to about 80%. But so that's a good marker, that if you're looking at American Muslims at about a 60% level support gay marriage, Americans at about 80% level support gay marriage. So that's what I'm talking about, the conservatism. But with my uncle, it really was this sense of his neighbors, once they got to know him, realized that, oh, on the one hand, this is someone who's different from you. He's brown, he's Muslim, he's from Pakistan, he speaks differently. On the other hand, he's much more like you than neighbors who are atheist, who are liberal, who are progressive. And so this brown Muslim guy actually has a shared value system with these folks. And I think that's the key here, that, I always talk to my world religions students about the fact that sometimes the most interesting differences aren't between religions. It's not between Muslims and Catholics, or between Catholics and Jews. It's within a religious tradition. How are Muslims different from each other? And that depending on the kind of Muslim you are, you may find much more in common with liberal and progressive folks from a different tradition. So I find much more in common. I'm on the much more progressive side of things, and the conservative side of things. So I find much more in common with Catholic worker Catholics than I do with, let's say, Opus Dei Catholics. But Catholic worker Catholics find more in common with me than they do with Opus Dei Catholics. And so this funny moment of do you get rid of the religious identity and say, what are the kinds of social values that I admire? And that, for me, it's a long way of getting to this, that for me is this really interesting difference in Canada and America. In Canada, in the 1980s, the Conservative Party of Canada, which, just by its very name, is the more right party, and the Liberals are the more sort of left, to use crude terms, party. The Conservative Party realized that its base was changing, that the traditional, Scottish Presbyterian who voted Conservative was no longer the Scottish Presbyterian. It was the Hindu business owner, it was the Sikh business owner, it was the Muslim doctor. And so if you took away the name Mr. Singh, Mr. Patel, Mr. Hussain, but saw he's a doctor, he lives in this neighborhood, he's a business owner, he does this, does that, that's your typical conservative voter. The Conservative Party made an effort for a bit to reach out to Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus. The Republicans here haven't done that, even though in the 2000 election, when I say this, it always amazes people. In the 2000 election, American Muslims, overwhelmingly, like 80%, voted for one candidate. That was George W. Bush. American Muslims in 2000 were heavily Republican. 2004, they shifted over to the Democrats, and since then they've been more towards the Democratic side. But it's this fascinating moment of thinking, like, other than the Islam part, we're actually kind of conservative, as a broad, again, I don't want to do the thing that we talk about other people being guilty of flattening out. We tend to be a little more conservative,
Do you think
socially and fiscally.
Do you think the shift to voting for Democrats has to do with the rightward drift in American politics?
Yeah, there's that certainly, but then obviously, after the Bush election, 9/11 happens, and with 9/11, you've got the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. You've got the national security entry exit registration system, the NSEER system, all those kinds of things, which really shifted things. But yeah, and that's the other side of it, is that oftentimes, if you're within America, you have no sense of the rest of the world, and to say that American politics is really pretty far to the right compared to
Yes, we are.
Canada. The Democratic Party does things that most conservative parties in the rest of the world wouldn't do, in terms of supporting the war, in terms of supporting tax cuts for the rich, in terms of not campaigning for universal health care, that kind of
There's a
thing.
historical sense in which it almost makes sense. I mean, as America is the most powerful country in the world, it makes sense that there would be a kind of political conservatism that would take over, because of course you want to preserve
the
and
status quo.
conserve, right? I mean, your status in the world, our
Absolutely.
status in the world
Absolutely.
as the most powerful country. So some of that makes sense. The demagoguery and the vilifying of subgroups just has always struck me as just sort of a blind alley.
Right.
I don't understand it as I mean, clearly I don't know, because the 2016 election proved that you could win on a platform like that.
Right.
But the thing its weakness is something you had mentioned earlier in the conversation, which I wanted to get back to, the ordinariness of American Muslims in general. But one of the things that really called this out for me was looking at some of the Pew Research data, and you look at they have all of these sort of collective opinions of Muslims around the world, and how they how closely they adhere to Islamic fundamentals. And they're the numbers I don't remember exactly, 50, 60, 70%, these kind of strong numbers. The ones that they completely fell down on was the Hajj.
Right.
And so like the percentage of Muslims internationally that participate in the pilgrimage to Mecca is very, very low.
Right.
And I remember that struck me as exactly right, because so yes, you get these calls, you get people ask you about your opinions on things, and we all have very strong opinions about fill in the blank, whatever it might be, whatever jingoistic position, whatever we happen to be feeling that day. We're angry at our wives are angry at our husbands, our kids, whatever. Something came on the news that upset us. But when it actually comes to packing everyone up and paying the money to fly over, to go to Mecca, like the numbers are really low. And I thought, oh yeah, that's exactly right. This is people, right? This is human beings, that their commitments are as active as they can be based on the realities of their lives. And the realities for most Muslims, as it is for most human beings, is they have family pressures, they have work pressures, they have difficulties with their children, with their parents, divorces and unrequited loves, and illicit desires, all of these things that are of course true of Muslims, as they are true of Americans, as they are true of the Chinese, etc. Is there anything about being sort of a Canadian and then an American, is there any, do you feel more boxed in being an American, being a liberal college professor that is also a Muslim? Do you feel those restrictions on your identity?
Yeah. It depends on who you talk to and what situation you find yourself in. So, for example, after the 2016 election, a lot of my Canadian friends said, "So, are you still going to live in America?" And my stock answer was, I don't mean to be flip, I don't live in America. I live in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is not America. We have a mayor, Eric Garcetti, who's a Democrat, who's Jewish, who's progressive. We have a governor, Jerry Brown, who's Catholic, and it's a hoot to have the same governor as, Governor Moonbeam from the 70s, the Jerry Brown that dated Linda Ronstadt. He's got my respect for that more than anything else. Forget about the Jesuit training, forget about who his dad was, just that kind of thing, that, this is a different place. And maybe that's the point of the exercise, is that you look at even America. What does it mean to be an American? Well, I'm really a Californian, and I'm really an Angelino. because that defines my experience of America. You know, part of the reason I did the book with Baylor University Press, actually the real reason I did the book with Baylor University Press was precisely because it's Baylor University Press. It's a Baptist university in Waco, Texas. These are the folks who don't know the kinds of things in a way that you would expect the folks in LA or New York to know. These are the folks who might pick up this book precisely because of the networks that Baylor has to get it out to folks in Oklahoma and Texas and Arkansas. I don't want to say that there aren't those kinds of issues and problems in the rest of the United States. There are, but I think we don't see that. So this narrative that President Trump is very sharp on of immigrants as being a threat, as immigrants as being a danger, you know, by calling out a particular gang, you know, in the State of the Union, anyone that works with gangs knows you don't do that. You don't give the name, you don't give that respect to this particular group here. But this idea that it's immigrants that cause our problems, when all the studies show, of course, that the crime rate among immigrants is much lower than the crime rate among native-born folks, you're much more likely in this country to be killed in a violent act by a white person than by a Muslim, and yet, you know, the fear of Muslim terrorism, you know, there. Now, does that mean that Muslims don't commit terrorist acts? Of course not. We saw that with 9/11. We saw that with the Orlando shootings. We saw that in New York. But do they commit them at a much lower rate than other Americans? The answer, in fact, is yes. If you look at the number, you know, you're much more likely to be killed by an American, you know, in a shooting than by a Muslim American, you know, in a shooting. But we don't think about that. We don't think about our own society. Other folks do this, and you know. So I moved here in 1997. 1998, I'm living in the Valley, teaching at Cal State Northridge, working with Eddie Feinstein, who was the rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom, who still is one of the biggest synagogues there, you know, in Encino. And so 1948 is the 1998 is the 50th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel. And so I was working with Eddie on a program there, and I'll never forget this. There were people from Israel who didn't want to come to America because it was too violent. And you're thinking, you understand this is Encino, right? Like, there aren't drive-bys in Encino. This isn't Boys in the Hood. This isn't Compton. You know, and these are people from Israel. The average American would say, Israel. I'm not going to Israel. I could get killed there. Here's the Israelis going, America. I don't want to go to America. It's violent. But we don't realize oftentimes, because we're in it, our own violence, you know, our own issues, that you're much more likely to be done harm to by, in fact, someone from your community than by the foreigner who comes here. You know? But we don't think in those kinds of terms.
Yeah. Do you think, is there a way in which you are hopeful for what might be done or accomplished on the other side of, and I try to be careful not to, because clearly I have certain political views, I have certain allegiances, but there are a lot of Americans that the election of the president, and not because of his race primarily, but because of the narrative of a distrust of government. I mean, you have nearly as much vilifying of President Obama as you did of President Clinton. And the same sort of rabid fear of, and to be fair, in the history of the world, governments have not been all that trustworthy. Today, in today's sort of climate, governments are not always that trustworthy. So I am sympathetic to that suspicion, that concern. But that being said, it definitely seems clear to me in the last 20 years that there has been a devolution in our faith in the American project. Are you at all hopeful that that corner can be rounded? And if you are hopeful about it, what do you think the contributions can be from people that are on the margins to helping us overcome that?
So I think there's a couple of things there. Yes, I'm hopeful. You know, I think I said this before. As an educator, you shouldn't get into education if you're not hopeful. It's going to be a really, you know, hard road if you're not. As someone who became a U.S. citizen in 2013, you know, there's a hope there for this country. I think part of it is that the nature of our politics has shifted to extremes precisely because it's a small group of people that actually control the elections. What I mean by that is over half of the registered voters in this country did not vote in the 2016 election. So neither Mrs. Clinton nor Mr. Trump got the majority of the electorate. The majority of people did not in fact vote. A certain percentage voted for Mrs. Clinton, a slightly smaller percentage voted for Mr. Trump. And so I think that's part of the issue is we begin to polarize things precisely because so many Americans don't vote. How do you get Americans to be politically engaged? How do you get Americans to say that, yeah, this matters? Yes, you may have suspicion of government, but this is what determines how much taxes you pay. This is what determines if your roads get fixed. This is what determines what kind of school your kid will go to, assuming your kid is going to a public school. But even now with some of the changes, maybe even with private schools, there's some issues there. And so I think for me, it's that kind of education. Part of it is precisely folks on the margins who benefit from government. Like I grew up working class poor in Canada. In Canada, government was not seen as a bad thing. I think in terms of providing for education, in terms of providing social services, in terms of providing, those kinds of things, that's crucial. And to have that as a sort of safety net for all its citizens, and then you allow folks, who have means and wealth and privilege or whatever to be able to do the kinds of things that they do. Canada has a two-tiered healthcare system. If you're an ordinary person in Canada, you'll wait in line to get an MRI. If you're a rich person, you'll go to a private MRI clinic within Canada or, fly across, to Buffalo or wherever you are, close to the American border and do that kind of thing. And so when we talk about a basic level, that's what puzzles me, is to say that every study that I've read shows that if children are educated and healthy, we as a society are better off than if they're uneducated and unhealthy. Why we don't provide for that, why we don't provide for children's health care in this country just amazes me. And oftentimes it takes the folks on the margin to say, look, my kid is sick and my kid may die because he doesn't have access to health care. How is that fair? How is that good for us, as a people? Doesn't mean that the kid has to go to the Mayo Clinic. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that we have to have that kind of level. And I think that's really where we begin to engage folks who precisely need the kinds of services that I think all of us think that government are supposed to provide. We may be suspicious of government, but we really like it if the fire department comes and puts out the fire.
Absolutely.
We really may be suspicious of government, but we really like it when the police officers come because the burglar's been reported, in our building. We may be suspicious of government. We really like it when they fix the pothole on the street, in front of our house.
Turn on the tap water.
Turn on the tap water. The water is clean. Our kid can go to a school that's actually a good school. And so I think that's really the kind of key there. That this myth that somehow it's the government that's strangling people. You look at the sort of regulations about environment, that kind of thing, and that's this huge kind of issue to say, look, we need to have those in place. Look at what happened in Flint. Look at what happened in places, with lead paint. Look at what happened in places with fracking. You need to have a government that keeps a check. And I think the ideals of America, checks and balances, the executive branch of government, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, those are really powerful. The problem, of course, is, we've sort of lose those where if all three are controlled by one party, one, acquiesces to the other, that's the real issue.
Yeah, one of the things, and I'll use that as a segue to a question to wrap up, one of the questions I'd want to ask you, to go back to the book, you, towards the end, you mentioned Merle Haggard. And which I loved because I grew up with a father who grew up in Arkansas and listened to country music, and so I'm very familiar with. One of the songs you didn't mention was Big City, and he says, "Turn me loose, set me free, somewhere in the middle of Montana." And I've been working every day since I was 20, and there are folks who never work and they have plenty. And this way in which the margins, that the middle of America is clearly marginalized in popular American culture.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you think of like Friends and even Will and Grace, for all of its positive contributions to sort of consciousness around LGBTQ issues, that one of the things that I found that I think is fruitful, and one of the areas where I think we can positively contribute to that American story is that these people in the margins that you were just speaking about, right? That no, it's not about everyone flying in first class.
Right.
It's about people still having access to the trays on the back of their airline seats and not having their knees buried in their chests.
Right.
And that there is a way in which marginalized communities, American Muslims, as powerful voices and shapers of those marginalized communities, can speak back to those injustices that the 85% of us feel that we live. Is there anything that you see on the horizon in the next handful of years that productive areas where we can critically engage as Muslims, as marginalized Americans, you know, fill in the blank, in order to push that discourse forward that moves past some of the virtue signaling on the left, which is a fair criticism on the right, I think, that pushes past some of the kind of the fad of having the right opinion, but it can actually meaningfully improve our prospects in the 21st century.
I think for me the key is seeing that commonality, precisely seeing that common humanity, not just doing what's good for me. I mean, what's more American than sort of helping your neighbor, you know, helping each other out. That's how we survive as Americans. You know, that's what we do. That's what makes us, you know, Americans in our best selves. And so I think exactly making those kinds of links, making those kinds of connections for folks. You know, we talk in academia in the last, you know, 5-6 years about intersectionality as if it's a new thing. Well, I mean, it's always been there that we have these multiple kinds of identities. On the one hand, I'm a Muslim. On the other hand, I was born in Pakistan. On the other hand, I'm a hockey fan because I grew up in Canada. On the other hand, I grew up listening to country music. You know, all those things, you know, are complicated parts of who you are. But at the end of the day, do we work together? Do we think that it's important for our neighbor to have access to healthy food, to clean water, to a doctor for her child when, you know, she's sick? Or do we say that's limited? That should be something for the privileged. I mean, that's one of the fundamental differences between America and every other country is healthcare. Any other country, healthcare is a right for the citizens. It's something that the state should provide for the citizens. Here it's a privilege. And you think that, how is that possible? Now this, I'm connecting this to American Muslims. That, you know, one of the groups I write about in the book, the Ummah Clinic. Ummah is the Muslim word for community, you know, the coming from the same mother. But in this case, it's an acronym, University Muslim Medical Association. 20 years ago, you had Pakistani and Arab doctors coming out of UCLA who thought that both as Muslims and as doctors, their job was to provide health care. They set up a clinic. They've taken over Fremont High School. They provide all sorts of services. And so it's this idea that, you know, as an American Muslim physician, both as an American and as a Muslim, and sort of as a physician, my job is to provide health care for people. And so that example of Muslim physicians treating almost entirely non-Muslim patients, you know, most American Muslims, you know, are wealthy, successful. You know, I'm not saying there aren't working class folks, there are, but, you know, many of us have health care. We don't need, you know, a free clinic because we have access to health care, you know. What do you do with the folks that don't? And so I think that kind of thing, what would it be like if we got health care for kids, starting with kids? Because who's going to object to health care for kids? You know, is that a way into education? And I think for me, it's that kind of work, that kind of solidarity that I think is really crucial. That do we come up with that kind of connection, you know, with each other? Do we see ourselves as connected with each other, or do we see ourselves in these kinds of elites? You know, one of the things I love about my job is I get to travel. I get to go to places, and not, you know, exotic kinds of places. You know, I'm going to a conference at John Carroll University in Cleveland. I'm giving a talk at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. You know, the reality of life in Pittsburgh, the reality of life in Cleveland is very different than the reality of life in Los Angeles. When you look at, you know, what happens, who gets marginalized. You look at the flights, the fact that there's no direct flight from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles. You think about those
Oh, is
kinds
that right? You
of,
can't fly direct
you
from- I
can't fly
didn't know
direct.
that.
You got to,
Okay.
but it's that, but it's those kinds of things where, who gets to fly? Where do the airlines go?
Absolutely.
Is that something we should be paying attention to? Why does it cost so much more for me to fly to Pittsburgh than for me to fly to Washington, D.C., when Washington, D.C. is a much further flight? Well, of course, because I got to make, a stop on the way, I got to do those kinds of things. So, but again, I think that's really the key, that if as Americans we think that our ideal is to help each other, if as religious people, and most Americans are religious people, we think it's our ideal to help people, why are we surprised that Muslims want to do this, that Christians want to do this? And I think that's really the key, to see it in that way, rather than, oh, no, they have a very different religion. They don't value life. They don't, and I mean, it's just absurd when you think about this idea that, somehow Muslims are a death cult, or somehow Muslims, want to take over the world and kill folks. You want to say, but that, do you see the world? Do you see what's going on? Oftentimes we don't see our own thing. It's much easier, and this goes back to, forget about Islam. What was it that Jesus said about the person who has, the log in their eye, and they're concerned about the speck in their brother's eye? This is 2,000 years ago. We were saying exactly the same kind of thing. That, do we not see the fundamental inequities here, in the way we're living, and don't pay attention to that, but say, oh no, look at what that person over there is doing.
Yeah, I definitely agree that sort of the way forward is an acknowledgement of our common humanity and the difficulties of that. Amir, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Pleasure.
Thank you. I do B-roll footage or any that kind of stuff,
so.
where that comes in.
Yeah.
Where that comes in. Yeah, I'm sorry. The beep it's the time. It's at sunset, so that my watch beep, because it's the
Oh,
watch
it's
that
okay.
beeps for
Don't
the
worry
prayer.
about
So yeah, but you'll be able to cut that out, I think.